Hi everybody. In this video, we're going to start diving into how to start adding some aged, darkened sections to our material and still make this look believable and interesting. So the first thing we want to do is start to add in another fill layer. As you can see, that's kind of the main process that we use here for the most part. Now, what I do want to do is start to just set this to maybe kind of a darker tone, maybe with a little bit more red, a little bit more brown. And I want to set this base color to multiply. I want that to kind of sit on top of everything else. Now, as for everything else that's here, so for height information, don't want that metalness, don't want that normal, don't want it. Rough, I do want, but I do want it to be a lot less intense. So it could be, maybe 50% in here. It kind of doesn't really matter. But our roughness in our layers is turned on. So I do want to set this to being just kind of turned down, and actually just got to make sure that normal is turned on here. My roughness actually does need to be set to normal. I meant to set my base color to this. So basically, in this case, I'm basically just having a small effect added here of a roughness kind of change. Let's just even go a little bit smaller and just have a small transitional change here. I don't want it to be too strong in this case. Let's just bring that down, just see just a little bit of a minor change. That's perfectly fine. Go to base color. Now we do want to set this to multiply. That's much better. And we can bring the opacity of that down still quite a bit as well. That's pretty good. So that will be what the worn down sections of our material will look like. And let's just add a black mask. Now in this case, we do want to go back to our paint mode and start painting in here. So let's just go to a fill layer, or in this case actually a generator. And we'll be generating using our mask generator. It's one of our easiest spots to go to. If you felt like, however, you could jump to these smart masks and start to try to play with some of these, because we can get some really interesting stuff out of this. Such as if we start picking something like Dust Soft and kind of dropping that in here as our generator, we're going to get a number of different kinds of effects out of this. So in this case, let's see the result there. It's a very soft effect in this case, so you don't see it very well here. But we could start dropping in something that's a little bit more intense, maybe like this dust occluded. In this case, again, it's also a very subtle effect. Dust dirty will certainly be quite a bit more intense here. There we go. You can start to see how some of that's going to start building into the surface. And my recommendation would be play with a bunch of these. See if it starts to kind of give you a little bit more of what you want in this case. This variation of it is also still a little bit too soft. And again, my suggestion would be you kind of play with it. You see if it's giving you some of the results that you want. I find a lot of times I've got to make custom ones for myself because most of the time they don't quite do what I want. They're a little bit too intense, or as you can see here, like this really hits the edges very hard. It doesn't necessarily look like the reference that I was kind of gathering. But it's always worth trying to figure out if any of these are going to give you the results that you want without you necessarily having to go through a lot of that hard work. And in some cases, you're going to get some variation, some kind of detail in here that may be worth keeping, and you can kind of just build up on top of that instead. And that's certainly a worthwhile thing to do. So for example, actually this one's already got a pretty interesting result from it that we could certainly build on top of. There's no reason we have to kind of totally ignore it. For now, I'm just going to hide it because it's not giving me quite what I want. So let's make our own generator and go into mask editor. Now in this case, what I want to get out of this is a lot more in the ambient occlusion area here. Now what you'll see is it's also still not very intense in this case. Let's just click this here. I may want to increase the balance that goes on here so that this shows up a lot more intensely than it did before, so that our global balance gets pushed up just a bit more than it did previously. My curvature as well I want to adjust, as well as some of the settings inside of our ambient occlusion, such as in this case, as I intensify this, you'll kind of see that it's not quite doing what I want. It's kind of taking away this inside section, which is totally not what I want in this case. So if I just invert or simply set this to something like screen, in this case, we may want something that is a little bit more usable. So we just want to actually invert this and make sure that this is set to screen. In this case, what's going to happen for us is as we bring this down, our balance is going to be pushing up those what used to be darkest values and brightening them in this case. So as we bring this down a bit more, we start to really intensify those cavities. This can become kind of confusing to work with because you're inverting this, setting it to screen. So now the balance here that you're working with, balance is basically pushing towards our darkest or pushing towards our brightest. It gets a little bit backwards because now our brightest is our darkest. And so it starts to become a little bit confusing as to what to expect from this. Sometimes it kind of just becomes fiddling with it a little bit. Not exactly what you want in every scenario, but it does become a little bit confusing to work with initially. We could increase our contrast, but again, we don't really want to do that. We want a lot of ambient occlusion coming from this. We want a lot of softness from those shapes and just kind of pushing that out. So you can see here in these cavity areas, we've got a lot of brightness showing up, which means some of these details are actually going to appear where they should. Next, for our curvature, we do want to have this happen on the cavities in this case. And we want to make sure that this is adding on top of what is already here. So for example, you can see our ambient occlusion is still present. So that's working the exact way that we want it to. And we could even probably go with some bigger details here, I think. Even big in this case. Just trying to make sure that we maintain some of those soft details as well. Sometimes if you're going to these large details, you can tend to lose some of your small stuff a little bit too much, which you want to watch out for. So that's pretty good. We're starting to get some pretty big shape out of this. We could even brighten up this a little bit more, but we're starting to get into some pretty ungainly territory here, which you just want to watch for. Huge, we could bring up a little bit more. But even in this case, you start to see that if we just lower the huge down, we maintain some of these larger scale shapes, which I think are going to be a little bit better in this case. Big seems to be giving us some shapes like this, and large also giving us some pretty good stuff. Now that means we've got a lot of crevices that are getting some kind of grunge buildup basically going on in there. And those are going to work really, really well for us. So that's pretty good. I could also just increase the intensity of all that if I wanted to, but I think just leaving it default is relatively fine. World space normal and position gradient aren't really necessary in this case. We could use them, we just really don't need to. Thickness is always kind of a wild card. It's a little hard to expect to see what you're going to get out of this. So for example, these outside edges are getting brightened, but these inside ones aren't. And again, that's just not really what I'm looking for in this case. All right, so now we want to start adding in some kind of texture to this. So for example, I do want like kind of a brushed look, and there is a grunge map that will work for that, this grunge brushed. And again, you find that just kind of by looking for it. So we just drop this in. Now what we're going to do is slide here back up to our parameters area and into our textures 1. Now what I want to do is start to turn up how much this is showing up on the surface. I want this kind of brushed quality showing up on these areas. Now I'm ignoring what's happening here, and I'm really just focusing on what's happening in these other sections. So basically, I want to get this looking pretty interesting. I think I need to use triplanar in this case so that I can get some vertical striations showing up. I want to bring that scale down a little bit so that this starts to look like a more appropriate kind of brushed sort of stain that appears on this surface. I may want to increase that contrast a little bit. Now in some cases this could work perfectly fine, but it's also still worth trying to play with some of our other settings here, such as add and sub. Now this will start to do some really, really interesting stuff for us. If I just lower that contrast a little bit, we're going to get some really intense kind of striations going through here. We actually maintain very little bit of what we started with. So if you look at overlay, for example, you'll see we've still got kind of these soft details, but that's not how these surfaces show up. Again, if we look at some of those old pieces of reference that we had, they were really, really strong, sharp kinds of details that were showing up in there. So if we do add sub, basically we're getting a really exaggerated result of what we had before, and we start getting this like very, very textural kind of quality in these shapes here. If I press M, you can kind of see how that shows up here. And it starts looking pretty darn convincing in a lot of spaces, looking very worn, very old, and we start getting some really nice results out of that in a number of different sections. And so that is actually very much what I'm looking for. If I wanted to soften that out, I can do that too. But maybe I want to add in just a little bit more into this as well. So for example, maybe I want to add some scratches. So for example, we can go into our grunge scratches rough, or even just scratches by themselves, but those don't look very convincing. So let's use scratches 1. Let's drag this over into secondary. Scrolling up, now there's, of course, we've actually got a number of settings in here that we can add to, but let's just work with some of our basic elements here. Let's just increase our texture 2. Now what you're seeing is it's not quite giving us the result we want. Let's just set this to screen. Now, why screen? Well, again, just check your texture to see what the appropriate result is to start. In this case, these scratches themselves are white, so if they're being screened on top, it means they're revealing the scratches as a dark edge. Now, obviously, this is way too big, so let's bring that scale down a lot. And we can start to see we've got these just little scratches kind of building up in here. Let's go just a little bit smaller as well, so we've got something quite a bit more manageable to work with. And that's actually already looking pretty darn good. So we could basically leave it at that if we wanted to, or we could just lower that brightness so that the actual scratches themselves are just a small accent on top of the rest of this, giving us just a little bit more variation on this surface and wearing it down quite a bit more in the process. Now, if we wanted to minimize the intensity of this, again, we can just come in here, lower the intensity of that effect so that we're seeing it here a bit, but it's not affecting the roughness too much. We could come back to our roughness, maybe increase its effect just a little bit more, or decrease it entirely so that you actually don't get any of that effect there, and it really just is a stain on that surface, which ends up looking really convincing and a bit more subtle than if we'd done it the other way around. Let's actually just increase the darkness of that just a little bit more, because I think that makes for a pretty interesting surface variation on just the color. And that's pretty darn good. You could add some height to it if you wanted, maybe just pushing it down just a little bit, much less than this. You got to go to very, very small amounts to make that kind of thing work and not be too obnoxious looking, because you want to keep that variation pretty small. And in this case, that's just not working, so let's just remove that height altogether. And this works pretty darn well. We're getting some neat variation out of that. It's always good to see how it looks on this surface. I can hold Shift and right-click and drag to kind of move that light source around as well, just to see how that looks on these other surfaces. If I want to see how it looks on these other pieces, let's just Shift, right-click, and drag to move that light. And that's pretty darn good on the rest of these surfaces here. Nice. So the next thing that we want to do is start to add in a little bit more color variation going on our edges this time to make this piece look a little bit more complete as well.